And if you follow the Ukraine war, the experience of Ukrainians is presented not just in statistics, but in human terms. So that what's it like for Ukrainian children to be studying in underground shelters? How many articles have you read over the years about what's it like for Gazan children to be studying in underground shelters? Of what it's like to be in the front lines fighting against the Russians? How many articles have you read about what's it like for Palestinians to be in the front line fighting against the Israeli military? Furthermore, how much do we hear about what's happening in the West Bank? Now in the West Bank, today or yesterday, they killed another 13-year-old boy. Another one, in addition to the one they killed last week. And the one kid they killed last week was shot by a sniper for about 100 meters away. The kid had a firecracker in his hand, celebrating Ramadan. Did you hear about that in the Vancouver Sun? Did you hear about it on the CBC? Did the New York Times report it? No. So that the constant, daily killings and oppressions and humiliations, they just don't exist in our minds because our media don't report it. I've been to the West Bank. I was there 2 years ago. I went there, brought in by some Israeli and Palestinian psychologists to work with women tortured in Israeli jails. And somebody told me there that we don't have post-traumatic stress disorder here because the trauma is never post. It's always with us. Now, when you look at what studies have been done, I will quote some for you. There was a study done in published in 2005, I think. They said that among children 10 to 19 years, don't forget, this is, 18 years ago now, 19 years ago. Among children aged 10 to 19 years, 32% suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms requiring psychological intervention. That means a third of the kids had PTSD. We're talking about kids from age 10 to 19. 42% had moderate, 49% had moderate post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, and only 2.5% had no symptoms. %46 of the parents reported aggressive behavior amongst the children. 38% had bad school results. 27%, a quarter of kids had bedwetting. 39% said that their children suffered from nightmares. This is over 15 years ago now. This is before Hamas actually became the government of Gaza. Since then, Gaza has been subjected, as you know, to this terrible blockade. It has been bombed a number of times, 4 or 5 times, bombings that killed hundreds of people, thousands of people, hundreds of children. And when we talk about these current events in the media here, it's like history began on October the 7th. When these crazy people did these terrible things. So The Israeli historian Ilan Pappé, who has documented the Nakba, and this is what's really interesting, is that a whole group of Israeli historians have documented the Nakba. For decades, you didn't talk about that in Israel. But more recently, starting in the 1990s, people began to do research. And what did they find out? They found out that what the Palestinians have been saying was right. So here, I'm going to quote you one Israeli historian, if I can find it quickly. And this guy is still a Zionist. In fact, when you look at him recently, he was on television arguing in favor of the war that's going on right now and justifying it. But he did his research and he published his books a couple of decades ago. It's like he's ignoring the implications of his own research. His name is Benny Morris. And he said, now this is a Zionist, you have to understand. He said, what the new material shows, he's talking about 1947-48, is that there were far more Israeli acts of massacre than I had previously thought. He said, to my surprise, there were also many cases of rape. 1948. Rape of Palestine. Does anybody ever talk about that? In the month of April to May 1948, now don't forget, if you know the history, you know that the state of Israel was declared, I think, on May the 15th, 1948. That was followed by a very anemic and very weak intervention on the part of some Arab countries. And so then now they say that they started the war, so that now we expelled them. Of course, of course we did. But no, here's the story. Before the Arab countries intervened, as ineffectively and disunited as they did, Benny Morris, the Zionist historian, says, in the months of April to May 1948, units of the Haganah, this is the Israeli army at the time, were given operational orders that stated explicitly that they were to uproot the villagers, expel them, and destroy the villages themselves. Well, that's a war crime. I'm from Eastern Europe, Hungary. As you know, I'm Jewish. My grandparents died in Auschwitz. I almost did. Came very close as an infant. You can travel through Eastern Europe, where there used to be a very thriving and very vibrant cultural and economic and demographic Jewish life in Transylvania, in Poland, in Slovakia, Northern Hungary. And you'd never know that there used to be Jewish life there. The synagogues are gone. The buildings have been long taken over or destroyed. The cemeteries have been bulldozed over. And you'd hardly ever know that there was Jewish life there for centuries. I've been to Israel. I've traveled through Israel. You can travel through Israel and never know that there used to be Palestinians living there. Never know that there used to be mosques, villages, cemeteries, orchards, a vibrant life. You wouldn't know it. No sign of it. In that sense, some of what happened to the Jews in Eastern Europe has been mirrored in Palestine. Now, how did that come to happen? Well, of course, we all understand the Jewish trauma in Eastern Europe that gave rise to the Zionist movement, given the persecution and the often violent persecution of Jews in Eastern Europe in the late 19th century and before the early 20th century. You might say it made perfect sense for the Jews to say, we need a country where we can be our own masters and we can protect ourselves and have our own life and not always be worried about being attacked. That, that's one way to think about it. That wasn't the dominant Jewish movement, by the way. Most Jews didn't go for that for a long, long time. There were many other movements looking for different solutions, but that was one stream of solution, and you can say on its own terms, it made sense. And as you know, there was a Zionist slogan, a land without people for a people without a land. Well, there never was a land without people. Palestine had a thriving community of farmers, peasants working on the land, merchants, intellectuals, religious figures. There was a culture there. There was a people there. And Zionism well understood. They knew it right from the beginning that they're never going to be able to take over that land peacefully. Because as the main Zionist leaders said very openly, no people ever gave up their homeland peacefully for somebody else to move in there. So this idea that the conflict between the Jews and the Palestinians was created by Palestinian irrationality and refusal to make peace is totally refuted if you read Zionist history. They knew it. They knew it. How else could it have been done? And this historian that I quoted, Benny Morris, he said, that Ben Gurion, the first prime minister, was right. If we had not done what we did, a state would not have come into being. That has to be clear. It is impossible to evade it. Without uprooting of the Palestinians, a Jewish state would not have been established here. This is from a person who thinks it was a good idea. He doesn't think it was a good idea to rape people or to massacre them. He's given credit. He's against that. But he's completely in favor of uprooting the Palestinians, booting them out, destroying their homes, robbing of them billions of dollars of their property, and giving it to immigrants from Europe or from other parts of the Middle East. So it could not have been done in another way. In other words, the trauma was unavoidable, given Zionist logic. And given the Zionist logic that has just become even more intransigent, even more insistent, the trauma that's ongoing now was also inevitable. So when we talk about the Israeli invasion of Gaza as being, there's a debate in the West, is the Israeli response exaggerated? Is it too extreme? But there's an assumption in that question, which is that what's happening right now is a response to October the 7th. No, it isn't. What's happening right now is simply the culmination of the Zionist project that has been moving towards this inevitable clash for a long, long time. And it's happening not as viciously, because they can't do it, but just as inexorably and with immense brutality in the West Bank as well. So let me tell you a little story. This is actually from the New York Times. It's almost unbelievable. I mean, you read this and you think you're living in some alternate universe. So, Israeli settlers who are now armed by the Minister of Police of Security, Internal Security, is now Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's a settler himself. And until a few years ago, he had a portrait on his wall. Do you know of whom? Of a guy called Baruch Goldstein. And Baruch Goldstein was the guy who, at the beginning of Ramadan in 1994, went to the Abraham's cave, or the cave of the patriarchs, and massacred 30 Palestinian civilians. And he's considered a hero by a lot of people. If you go to his grave, all these heroic inscriptions and appreciations. And the Minister of Internal Security of Israel used to have his portrait on his wall until a few years ago. Can you imagine the outcry that would happen if in Canada a cabinet minister would have the portrait of a mass murderer on his wall or her wall? But what does happen in Canada? Anyway, I was going to tell you this story. So, these settlers, they regularly harass the Palestinians. You can read about it in the Israeli press. You'll never read about it in the Western press. But in this case, there was a story in the New York Times. Like once a year, the New York Times will have an article, maybe or every 3 or 4 years, about the actual Palestinian experience. And in this particular story, the settlers came to this Palestinian village and they threatened the inhabitants, which they do regularly. They threatened them. And they said, we're going to come back and hurt you. So the Palestinians left the village. The settlers came and they went on a rampage of destruction. And they destroyed homes. They, filled in wells, the usual stuff that they do. A few days later, the villagers came back. They were met by a representative of the Israeli occupation. And the representative of the Israeli occupation said to these villagers that had just come back to their homes that had been damaged, he said, you can come back, but you can't repair anything. Because if you try to repair the damage, that would be construction without a permit. And you're not allowed to do that. So where they destroyed your roof, and now it's November or December, and the cold rains of winter are falling into your living room, you can't put a tarp above it. Because if you put a tarp on your living room, that would be construction without a permit, and we'll come and bulldoze your home. This goes on every day. And it's not reported. So we don't even have to think about the horrors that the internet presents to us, the alternate media, the pictures of the starving children, the horror of physicians having to amputate the shattered limbs of children without anesthesia. They're sawing off limbs without anesthesia because they don't have any anesthetic. The Israeli occupation doesn't let in certain medical supplies. You know what they didn't let in last week? A week or two ago? They didn't let in surgical scissors. Surgical scissors that are necessary for operations. Big danger to the security of Israel that Palestinian surgeons should have decent equipment to work with. So what I'm saying to you is that the occupation itself in all parts of Palestine, what should have been at least recognized as Palestine after Oslo, the West Bank and Gaza, has been a brutal, vicious entity. The full horror of it is not even barely whispered about in the Western press. You have to go there and see with your own eyes, and even when you see it, it's hard to believe it. And I've been there a couple of times now. I was there first in 1992, during the first Intifada. And it's much, much worse when I went back 2 years ago, 30 years later. It was much, much worse. So what are Palestinian children experiencing? They're experiencing bombing. The biggest traumas when you do these studies is after bombings. Now this is again long before the current terrible bombing. Can you imagine how traumatized those kids will be now? Can you even imagine it? There are 18,000 Palestinian kids who are orphans now in Gaza. That was a month or two ago. I don't know how many there are now. You have to understand something. When you talk about a Palestinian orphan, you're not talking about a kid who's lost his mother and his father, or her mother and her father. Palestinians in Gaza lived in multi-generational families. We're talking about the wiping out of uncles and aunts, grandparents, and parents. So these people have lost their whole extended families, these kids. Can you imagine the trauma? Even without the horrors of war, kids are traumatized because there was an article in Haaretz, which is the only Israeli newspaper that barely speaks the truth. But there was an article about this Palestinian in the West Bank who's actually an advocate of peaceful resistance. He's an advocate of peaceful resistance. They come into his home in the middle of the night. They grab him. They beat him in front of his kids. Those kids are watching their parents being humiliated. Those kids are watching their parents helpless. What sense of security does the child have when the parent can't defend them, can't protect them, can't even protect themselves? So, there's no good news here. Now, when you think about the militants who stormed into Israel on October the 7th, who were they? Go back to that study that I mentioned that was done in 2005. Those highly traumatized kids, many of them. Could we understand, not to justify any particular behavior, but could we understand why they were why some of them might have been full of hatred and full of rage and full of desire for revenge? And then, do you condemn Hamas? Is the question that always comes up every time you open your mouth on this subject. Well, that's not the question. The question is, do we condemn cruelty? Do we condemn the killing of civilians? Do we condemn the killing of children? Do we condemn the injustice? Because these are the sources of historical trauma. And you can look at trauma in two ways, at least in two dimensions. There's the individual trauma, and that happens. That can happen to any number of reasons. If you look at the major traumatic events that affect children, there are things like violence in the family, or abuse of some kind, or the death of a parent. But you can also look at trauma collectively. And collective trauma affects whole peoples. And the Palestinians have been subjected to collective trauma now, not just since 1947-48, but for longer than that. Because much longer than that, they lived under foreign occupation. They lived under British occupation for a long time. And the British were brutal. The British occupation was a brutal occupation. As a matter of fact, the laws that Israel uses in the West Bank against the occupied population were the laws laid down by the British when they occupied Palestine. And those laws were selectively applied. They were not applied to the Jewish immigrants that the British favored. They were applied to the Palestinians. So that trauma has been going on for much longer. Now the question is why? You might understand, you can understand the Jewish trauma that would have impelled the desire for a state. But none of that would have happened or could have happened without imperial support. And here's you have to zoom out a little bit, because why would the British favor the creation of a Jewish entity in Palestine? Because it served the interests of the British Empire. The British at that time either controlled or aspired to control a lot of the Middle East. So after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War, the British and the French divided the Middle East between them like a nice cake. This belongs to you. Meanwhile, they lied to the Arabs. They promised the Arabs independence if they supported the war against the Ottomans, which the Arabs did, of course, many of them. But those were lies. Meanwhile, they made agreements with each other, the British and the French, to divide up the cake between them. Why? Because the Middle East was full of oil. And Gaza is not the first time that Arab populations are bombed by the West. The Iraqi war and the weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist, what was that about? Control of resources. By the way, keep something in mind. When you look at the Western press, the same press that gave us the weapons of mass destruction without any questions, without any doubts, even though a 5-year-old child could tell that the whole thing was a lie, are now giving us the current situation. That's how reliable they are. That little lie about weapons of mass destruction resulted in 500,000 civilian deaths. Do we even remember that anymore? It just happened 20 years ago. Do we still remember it? That 500,000 people died because of a lie? But that's not the first time the West bombed the Middle East. That happened in the 1920s when the British bombed Iraq and other places because some of these unreasonable people were not willing to accept foreign domination of their countries. So what I'm saying is that the Zionist project itself could never have been accomplished without the support of the Western empires, first the British and subsequently by the American ones. So we mustn't think about this purely in terms of as a fight between Arabs or Palestinians and Jews. It's a much larger dynamic that involves geopolitics that has been going on now for a couple of 100 years. And the reason we don't hear about this stuff is not because Jewish influence in the press or the media. I mean, there is some of that for sure. But it's much more because the media serves the interests of the dominant rulers. And so what we're seeing now there was a man a Jewish writer in 1895. His name was Asher Ginsberg. His Hebrew name was Ahad Am. And he visited Palestine in 1895. 1895, when there were maybe 30,000, 40,000 Jews in Palestine, but 600,000 Palestinians. And he said that if we continue to treat the Arabs this way, he said, all that's going to happen is that there'll be one small Mediterranean people tormenting another small Mediterranean people. He saw it coming, and he said, if this is the Messiah coming, I don't want to see him arrive. So the current horrors have been foretold for a long time. And it could have been seen and should have been seen and predicted. There was nothing unpredictable about October the 7th, and unfortunately, there was nothing unpredictable about what's happened since then either. So it's part and parcel of this whole long, traumatizing story that's been going on for a long time. Part of the reason, now that if there's any light, and in the near future looks terrible as far as I'm concerned. I'm not going to go into the politics of it, but I don't think anything positive is going to happen anytime soon. I think we're going to see more and more suffering, even after this terrible war ends. But if there's one light at all in all this darkness, is that more and more people are waking up internationally as to the realities of the situation. More and more people are seeing it for what it is. Fewer and fewer people are buying into this Western fairy tale that we're all about democracy and freedom and human rights. The Israeli journalist Gideon Levy, who I've already quoted, he said that there's no human rights without the liberation of the West Bank and Gaza. No human rights at all. What I can tell you from not the Jewish point of view, because there is no the Jewish point of view, fortunately, but from a Jewish point of view, even if it's a minority one, I can tell you that far more than ever before, I mean, I've been talking about this stuff since 1967. I used to believe in that Zionist dream. I woke up. So I've been talking about it since 1967. It's been a long time. But what I'm seeing now, which I found extraordinarily encouraging and inspiring, is that thousands and thousands of young Jews are speaking up now. And they're not buying into this story anymore. It's Passover coming up in a few weeks, the Jewish holiday of Passover. There's going to be some very uncomfortable conversations in a lot of families around this issue. Because generationally, if you look at the polls and if you look at the studies, fewer and fewer, even amongst the Jewish young people, are buying into this colonialist nightmare. So I'm hoping that in the long term, I'm trusting that in the long term, more and more people will wake up, and anything that's based on such a distortion, such lies, such cruelty, such brutality, is not sustainable. It's not going to last. I may not see the day when there's finally justice in Palestine. But I tell you, the slogan from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. Oh, you shouldn't say that. You're talking about genocide of the Jews. No, you're not. You're talking about from river to the sea, Palestine should be free. For everybody. I wish the same thing for Canada, by the way. I wish there wasn't, I wish there wasn't racism in this country. I wish the indigenous population wasn't treated the way it's being treated. Yeah, I'd like to see freedom everywhere. And certainly I'd like to see it there. And I think it's going to come. It may take a long time. I'm just going to say to you that you're here in Canada now, use your voices. Don't let them get away with it. And whatever you do, don't be intimidated by this lie that to speak it against this brutality, this cruelty, this horror is anti-Semitic. It's total nonsense. Total nonsense. Don't let them intimidate you with that. So whatever platform, whatever voice you have, be united and use those voices and speak up and speak out. I'm going to finish with a poem by a Sufi poet. He's from Persia, Iran. He lived in the 13th century. His name was Saadi. And he said, the poem is called Humanity and Suffering. And he says, humanity are members of one body, created out of the same essence. When one member of that body feels pain, others remain distraught. You, unfeeling to the suffering of others, are unworthy of the name human. Well, let's earn that name of humanity. Thank you. Thanks.
We have questions.
Yeah. How much time do we have left? Okay, so we have about 15 minutes for questions, comments. So if you have a question, is there a mic that's going to come around?
There, people can submit it through the barcode, and I'll ask the questions.
Oh, so they're getting, is that right?
Yeah, I'm getting them right here.
Okay, so you understand how that's phone, I guess, do you? Showing the depredations of Iran. This film won the prize. The Israeli Jew who was the co-director got on stage and he said, anti-Semite. Some German Jews said, who the hell are you to tell us that we're anti-Semites when we criticize our own state? You know, so how do you avoid being called an anti-Semite? You don't. What I'm telling you is let them call you what they want to call you. Don't let that intimidate you. That's the whole point. I mean, those of us who are Jewish here, they don't, but they call us anti-Semites, or they call us self-hating Jews, or, you know, they're always going to call you something. Why would they call you an anti-Semite? Because they don't have an argument to put against the public.